Well, no, I mean, you described it as very French, right? And I think
Yes.
I sort of like typecast it as that, and then in the end, ended up finding it far more fruitful than I expected to, and don't know whether I got the most out of it.
Yeah,
because
well,
I didn't. Because
yeah.
I like
Because of my semi-racist like lambasting of this text. What I meant by that, when we say something is very French on the show, what we mean is very like invisible committee ultra left kind of thing. What I meant by it is it was very verbose. It was very like
I thought that was what we meant by French.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Yes, flowery language, but I don't know, the language in this wasn't so much flowery as like just long.
It was academic. It's academic, perhaps,
yeah.
And maybe it's suffering something in the translation, right? I think it was written in French,
Sure.
But yeah, it's a bit academic-y.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, I think I'm of two minds where I'm like, because when I first went through it, I was like, oh, I was really struggling with the first half. And then the second half, I was like, oh, wow, this is actually like a really fascinating way of reading Marx. And then I went back through it right before I came on this call, and I was like, I don't know if I actually got that much from this. So I'm of two minds. We'll see. We'll see what we eventually do. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask, are you on, before we get started, are you on your party's emailing list?
No.
By any chance?
Okay. No, I did not get drawn into. Oh,
you should be. It's insane.
Why haven't I chosen to, well, no, for obvious reason. There's obvious reason why I haven't chosen to follow that up, because, maybe, I mean, it's possible. I mean, this could be a topic that we blend into discussion of this book, I suppose, but like there is, there's always part of me that wants these things to work, or wants to find some kind of substance in them, or I want to find some kind of synthesis between like, mainstream socialist activism and something a bit more to the left of that. So I can't just laugh it off, or sort of like, that's not what I'm saying you're doing exactly, but that's the obvious reason why I've done my level best to avoid watching the drama happen in real time, at least.
Well, it's not any kind of like, I'm not saying that for any kind of political disagreement at all. I'm just saying, did you hear what happened with last week? I think it was last week's, maybe 2 weeks ago, the kerfluffle where supposedly Zara Sultana authorized membership emails to go out. And like, I got a notification on my phone, and I was like, oh, maybe I should think about doing that, even though I don't live in the UK anymore. And then like 15 minutes later, it was like, stop, don't do that. I was like, is this a phishing scam? Like, what's going on? And then the reason I bring it up is because about an hour ago, I got another email saying membership is now open. So
I didn't know that. Okay, that's the new news that I wasn't privy to then. Okay.
Yeah. So
I can now become a member of your party.
Yeah.
Should I want to?
Yeah. Okay. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it does give the opportunity to be at the beginning of something, or like try and have it go in some kind of direction.
Yeah. I mean, the main argument too is just like, what are you going to do? Not join it? You know what I mean? Like, even if it, I don't know, even if it doesn't go anywhere, okay, you can just go back. Might as well join. It'd be interesting to see what happens. I'd like to,
but like, I mean, there is the advantage of being able to have the sort of like stoic academic, high and mighty attitude, which
sure.
Sometimes,
yeah,
has a draw, doesn't it? Has its own draw,
Being cool,
yeah.
Like, you fools.
More lefty than now,
Yeah, but I mean, the alternative is what? Staying in the Labour Party. So, yeah. Anyway,
I suppose the interest. I suppose there are lots of interesting groupings on the left, aren't there? It would be interesting to see how some of these other groups interact with it. I mean, that is there's a sort of negative version of what I'm proposing, which is I'm just going to tail some other organisations in. But like, it would be interesting. It'd be nice to see what a collective communist, I suppose, or something response to its formation is, and what people do with it, and how they try and utilise it, and also whether there's space in that organisation for more radical left formations to exist. Whether that'll be tolerated,
I mean, yeah. It would be really fascinating to see that if the party winds up getting organized along much more democratic lines, right? Which maybe it's looking like that isn't particularly what it's going to be. It'll obviously be better with more emphasis on like, I almost said the CLPs, obviously not the CYPs or whatever, the community, your parties, than the Labor Party has. But obviously that doesn't, like, I don't know. What I mean is more so about like creating a program, creating what it is that people want. Like, it doesn't seem like that's the way it's going, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because everything I can like, I believe Zara Sultana, and I guess I believe Jeremy Corbyn when he says our intention is to have it be a democratic, member-led, sort of like grassroots, sort of activist-centered party. But it does feel like there's so much structurally acting against that. The sort of mere fact that it's been created by a group of 6 MPs that are all sort of brought together almost by happenstance rather than, not that I know that much about it, but like they seem quite heavily divided on a lot of things, and as a whole, their politics don't necessarily represent the sort of mainstream of left of Labour politics. So it gives it all as like it has this air of potentially being more bureaucratic than it would otherwise purport to be, and it also has this air of being somewhat artificial in some ways, like just because it's this grouping, basically it's being spearheaded by a grouping that hasn't emerged from any organic political movement, I suppose, but it's an accidental grouping of MPs who, I don't know, feel obliged to form something because there is a lack of that thing to represent.
They're united in their dispossession, but dispossession more so in the sense that they've kind of been kicked out of the Labour Party. So, yeah. Man,
hey.
Yeah. My take, next election, gonna be weird. Gonna maybe not be that good of a time, but hey, who knows? We'll see. All right. Should we talk about this book?
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it.
This book I came across, it's Communism and Strategy by Isabelle Garo. Subtitle is Rethinking Political Mediations. And I had a similar but also kind of different experience to you, where I found this book in a thrift store, charity shop, and I was like, communism and strategy. Those are two things I'm interested in. Yeah. And honestly, I kind of expected it to be like a bit more of a kind of like the strategy I'm used to, which is maybe more of a like McNary kind of like game theoretical kind of like, how to take power in 3 easy steps, done via criticism of the Second International and Kautsky and Babel and all of these guys. This book was very much not that, and it probably would have behooved me to like open the book to suss it out before I was like, let's do this for the show. But it was really challenging, and challenging in a way like, I've said it was challenging to read. This is a dense book written in a very kind of like academic-y kind of way. And the whole first half of the book is her just kind of like critiquing various post-Marxist, postmodern theorists of political strategy. But challenging also in the sense of like, it actually kind of fundamentally challenged certain ways that I actually read Marx. And this latter half of the book is basically entirely a rethinking of how to read Marx. And it's one that's very based around strategy as defined about like, forget where Marx says it, but the famous quote where he's like, communism, we call communism as like the real movement of the current state of things or whatever. It's not like this program that we want to put into existence. It is actually existing society and these real contradictions that exist that are working their way through negation. It's all very dialectical, you see, blah, 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 blah. She kind of takes that to an extreme conclusion where reading Marx becomes less about trying to figure out what communism is and more about communism as process in a way that actually is kind of like pretty reminiscent of some ultra lefty kind of stuff in a weird roundabout way, because she's not engaging with them at all, really. I think she mentions the Invisible Committee once, and that's like the only reference to anything like that. Again, this book is mainly, feels like she wanted to write a criticism of post-Marxists, and she did, and then she kind of tagged this stuff on at the end. But the really interesting stuff and the really challenging stuff was how she reads Marx and how she defines strategy. And again, like, yeah, it's very challenging and really interesting. And it's funny because I went to look up some interviews with her, because I've never really come across her before. I've heard the name, but that's about it. And there are loads, but none of them are in English. And so it's like, oh, she just must be a huge deal in France. And I'm just an idiot for not really knowing about her. So yeah, it was very challenging. Be interesting to kind of talk it through.
Yeah. I mean, I found it quite fruitful. I think that it actually does touch on a lot of things that I've been struggling with, and maybe this podcast as a sort of collective, process of learning and reckoning with this kind of material, sort of things that we've touched on as well. So yeah, I'm sort of like, I'm provoked by it and I'm intrigued by it, and probably going to have to finish this podcast and then go back and start reading it again.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I'll confess, I don't know how much of this book you read in close detail. Like, I focused primarily on the end of it. I sort of got it with plenty of time and was like, oh, I might have, because we discussed reading some of the latter chapters, and we'll we'll try and do a classic read the conclusion and see what we think.
This was annoyingly not a book where you could really do that, because the conclusion didn't really wrap it all up.
Yeah, no. But I do feel like we may have taken the right strategy in the sense that, like, so like, just for the purposes of the listeners, like, the structure of this book is a very deliberate engage with what she takes to be some core examples of, like, contemporary post-Marxism, and contemporary in this context means people writing in the late 80s and early 90s, who some of whom are still alive, I think.
I think they're all still alive.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Leclerc.
Ernesto Leclau might not be, but maybe.
Okay.
I'd be. I mean, I'm continually astonished that Alan Badiou's still alive, if indeed he is. Oh no, I shouldn't say. Cut it. Anyway, so no, yeah, you're the three characters in question, maybe four, I'm not really sure, are Alain Badiou, Ernesto Leclau, and Negri, and I suppose probably Michael Hart to some degree as well. And then the way she structures it is to talk about those three thinkers first, and then afterwards to have several chapters on Marx and Marxist politics, to sort of like she sort of like takes them out of chronological order, but then is in a position to sort of subject this sort of post-Marxist grouping to a reading by Marx, I suppose. I mean, I guess the other interesting thing that she does that's worth noting is just sort of very deliberately skips over the experience of the Second and Third Internationals entirely as a kind of like an experience of sort of with like fruitful strategic material to learn from, I guess, which puts it in stark contrast with the sort of revolutionary strategy, I suppose. But I found that quite interesting as well, and it's quite, I mean, like, in a lot of ways, like, her reading of Marx clashes quite heavily with that particular strategy anyway, so it does make sense that she is in some ways in opposition to that, I guess.
I think I did quite. Yeah, I did. I went into this with the best intentions. I started the book a week and a half ago. I was like, I'm going to read all of it, but I did do quite a bit of skimming in the first bit, specifically the Badiou section, because my first go through this book, I was just, the section on Badiou, I was just like, I can't think of anything less interesting than like a hyper academic application of big brain set theory to communism. What even is communism? Who knows what communism is? We just have to like get there, man, that Badiou does. And the more I got into the book and the more I read the bits about how she actually reads Marx, the more I kind of understand why she was engaging with him and what it was that Badiou was doing. Because she doesn't, it feels like she doesn't criticize him as much as Hart Negri. Hart Negri is, she's just kind of like, what the fuck is the multitude? Like, come on, like, let's move on from that. But for Badiou, the way that he describes communism is completely independent of communism as a mode of production. And he really focuses on this, very French way of looking at it, which is like, it's a break. It's a radical break with the current existing society. That's what communism is. And Garo's way of reading Marx is kind of similar. I'm not too sure how much leeway there is. She criticizes that aspect of Badiou, but then she also says that for Marx, communism is like a very concrete political project that gets us out of capitalism. So kind of like both her, it seems like what she's taking from Badiou is this like way of viewing communism, which is not one that I've really ever considered, which is to ignore the new mode of production, to not really consider trying to create the perfect, laws for communist society, and to focus on the concrete political actions that are going to get us there. And that carries over into a reading of Marx, obviously. And it's very strange because like this is in super, super stark contrast to like a kind of a lot of councilist stuff, and like specifically the fundamental principles, where they're like, we'll get into this because she does actually talk about the Critique of the Gotha program, but like the fundamental principles, people go, they read the Critique of the Gotha program and they go, this is what communism is. That's what communism is. It's a new mode of production. Here are all of its economic laws. We'll figure out how to get there through some sort of system of councils, whatever. What Badiou and to a certain extent Garo were kind of saying is like the complete reverse of that. It's like, don't try to hyper focus on, creating this new mode of production, because it's going to be hyper situational and you do have to trust the working class to get there. All you can kind of do is try and build these political structures. And again, just to kind of circle back, like the way she disagrees with Badiou there seems to be because he's just focused on this event, this break that will like suddenly somehow get us to something that we don't really understand what it is. What she's saying is much more akin to what she thinks Marx is saying, which is don't focus on the mode of production as much, focus on the real movement now. And that's what strategy is. It's really, it's really, really, it's challenging. And again, I don't mean that in a like hard to understand. It kind of is, but it's also just like it challenges certain aspects of communism that I have in my head.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have a bit of a history with Badiou. I've sort of like tried to read it and write about it a very long time ago.
Another life.
Write about him in another life, yeah. And I suppose, I mean, the thing that I never really understood the mathematics set theory. Which is ostensibly the sort of like gives some kind of philosophical basis to this idea of events, which are the fundamental sort of like piece of philosophical terminology, I suppose. I guess the way I would imagine the way she both agree what you're recognizing in there being a similarity between her understanding of Marxism and communism, and some of the aspects of Badiou are in that kind of like focus on process, I suppose. I would imagine she would criticize Badiou for having a philosophical theory of the creation of sort of novelty in history or in social affairs or in any aspect of social life in the sort of thinking of human beings, as being almost entirely like spontaneous, sort of like emerging, almost in it. There being like a total discontinuity between what comes before the event and what comes afterwards. And Badiou's sort of philosophy is all about the playing out of, or rather, politics for Badiou is about realizing the consequences of the thing that has happened, and not really thinking about the process whereby that sort of like new creative spark was introduced into the political realm, I suppose. I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of like the idea I've come away with from the bits of this book that I've read is that she sort of like recognizes these three thinkers as sort of being fundamental to a revival in discussion of the sort of the idea of communism, like the word, and trying to rehabilitate the idea of a anti-capitalist, post-capitalist political process. she recognizes that they're all quite different to one another, and there isn't very much like dialogue or possibility for synthesis between their thinking. But I feel like one of the ways she does say that they are similar is that they're all actually quite anti-dialectical. And I think a lot of her thinking is, I mean, this whole idea of like strategy as mediation, to the degree that I understand it, is about revivifying her interpretation of Marx's understanding of the dialectic, particularly historical materialism. And so, like, she does that for her, although there is this sort of like a potentially similar focus on process rather than like program, I suppose. For her, it's all about a topic that's been quite interesting to us in the past, which is this relationship between continuity and discontinuity. And from a strategic standpoint, how do you relate to the material that you have to work with on a political realm, but then act to facilitate the sort of transformation toward a new mode of production, I suppose. Don't know if that makes any sense to you.
No, yeah, absolutely. Because that actually helped, because I think even though this whole book is a meditation on meditation, that's trying to, as you say, like rethink what it is that we mean by political mediations. It's actually a concept I just like immediately struggled with, where I was like, what mediations? Like, how is that term being used? It seems like it's being used to mean everything and also kind of nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good understanding of how she intends to use it. I found her discussion of sort of the idea of dialectics toward the end of the book, like a more fruitful description than a focus on the word mediation in and of itself.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, well, I mean, maybe we should get into the meat of it. I suppose, like, you've already sort of like suggested that she is taking from Marx, or ascribing to Marx, a strategy of politics, which centers on that central quote of like communism as the sort of abolition of the present state of things, or something. The real movement that abolishes the present state of things. It's and it shouldn't be considered either A, to be sort of like a program. You're not like in some ways I wonder whether this what I was thinking about a lot through this was whether this like agrees quite heavily with the kind of like Amadeo Bordiga like communist invariance, or whether it's actually starkly to the opposite. I couldn't quite work out. It's one of those, but I can't work out which one it is to some extent. But like, it's not about like having a political program, having a or it's not that in and of itself, like, you are not a communist because you believe in A, B, C, and D set of things. It's almost like you are a communist because you have some kind of, almost like, in some ways it's very hard for me to not think about it as like almost like a religious faith in the possibility of ultimately like human beings overcoming their dispossession and creating a mode of existence that allows for their full flourishing. You're a Marxist communist because, I don't know, you believe in a particular strategy for that coming about as a result of the types of struggle that are engaged in, the process of struggle, the things that are realized to be possible out of that process, I suppose.
Yeah. And I mean, it also, like, there is a huge trust in here in the proletariat, right? Like, there's a huge element of, like, almost to the extent of like, if the proletariat doesn't do communism, shrug, because that's the only way it's really going to work, which is obviously very reminiscent like of Marx, right? And it's interesting, like you mentioning her kind of like discussion on dialectics. When she talks about the critique of the Gotha program, she mentions that, a lot of people try to use that as, guilty. Like, a lot of people try to use that as a blueprint for communism, which on one hand, I'm all for, because like Marx is very much saying like, here are some things you need to do clearly for communism to work. But on the other hand, I think it was quite good for me to read this because she's also making the point that like, you really, really need to contextualize that document because it is a criticism of a political program that Marx did not write. And she's kind of like, you know, all of those different steps, Marx is kind of saying, well, here's what you would need to do to make that work. But he's not trying to transhistoricize anything. Like one of the main points of this book is she's like, don't ever take anything Marx wrote and transhistoricize it in a political sense. Like even the commune, she comes out and is like, the great kind of the best quality of the civil war in France is when Marx kind of makes the point that like the commune worked there because that was the concrete political strategy that was going to work, quote unquote, at that specific point in time, at that specific place. And you can't transhistoricize that. It's a similar thing that she's doing with the Critique of the Goth program and all of Marx's stuff, actually. And it's really interesting because, like I said, I'm going to try and tie this back to like what you're mentioning about her discussion on dialectics is that like for Marx, you don't have this program that sits idly all across history and is something that you can just apply to any situation. Boom, done. For Marx, when he does have a program, all of the different things, and the Critique of the Gotha program, like the program kind of is the transition, and it is something that is very like specific to a concrete strategy. And when she talks about like the mediations that Marx kind of suggests, those are like the means and the ends. So there's like this real, like I said, kind of at the beginning, like she takes that quote of Marx about communism being the real movement that abolishes the current state of things to like a really extreme degree, where she was like, therefore communists and the communist movement, like I almost don't really know how to say this, but like the communist movement is communism. You know what I mean? It's very alien to like, I'm still kind of trying to work through it in talking about it because it's very alien to me, specifically her discussion on Critique of the Gotha program, which I found quite enlightening, even if I'm not sure I fully agree with it. Like it's a very interesting take on program and mediations to be like, the movement is kind of everything, it's yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I find it quite thrilling.
Yeah.
And it, like in some way, I mean, when I come back to saying the things that have been challenging me, like, or challenging me recently about things we've been engaging with, it's like I've been wrestling with this initial response to the idea of the sort of fundamental principles and what can be taken from the Critique of the Gotha program, and almost turned it into a kind of like a feeling that communism is almost like quite materially easy, in the sense like we just have a program and we implement it, and then what we need to do is have a movement that's willing to take that up, kind of thing. And it almost had, to some extent, I've been thinking in terms of like, in the terms of what she's arguing against, which is like having a sort of like a principle, having a sort of academic plan for what it would mean to have communism. In some ways, it's the kind of like test of Marxism, test of communism thing, like falling foul of that test of communism bit. But the thing that she's quite heavily anti. Obviously, this is in some ways just a different way of formulating what you were saying about the sort of like trans-historicizing of historically specific events. But the other thing she's very anti is teleology. One of the ways that manifests is in a critique of Lenin's reading of the Critique of the Gotha program, right? She's very anti about this sort of like stagist understanding of like, first you have the revolution, you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, you have socialism, and then sort of something magical happens later along the road, and then you get communism, kind of thing. So she's presenting Marx as being very anti a stagist understanding of transition. Obviously, there will be a process of transition, but coming back to things we've tried to assert in the past about a reading of history and about the reading of like the transition to capitalism or the transition between other modes of production. Like at any point in time, are you able to actually say, like, it's only in historical hindsight that perhaps you can recognize that the transition has happened, and maybe the transition between to communism or to the post-capitalist mode of production is going to look something much more like that, or going to have that feeling about it. But the other thing she's really critiquing, and something that we can take away from it perhaps, is like she's criticizing any sense that communism will come about as some kind of like natural growth of the tendencies of capitalism, whether that's some kind of like technological advancement, or like making communism materially possible because we're just going to have replicators or something, or like a kind of like Hilferdingian, we're just going to, a capitalism is going to naturally accumulate all of the corporations into one massive state monopoly, and at that point we'll just have communism de facto because the state owns everything because it's just one big monopoly. So she's very critical of that kind of second international and third international understanding of the idea of the transition and the sort of attendant political strategies that come along with that, like the nature of the Social Democratic Party falling foul of this sort of like having a belief in the sort of natural growth of something within capitalism that will naturally sort of gestate into communism and doesn't really need this sort of mediating moment. And this is sort of coming back to the idea of mediation, or the sort of idea of the dialectic, I suppose. And it's also venturing into the bit that I don't really understand but feels very fruitful, is the kind of like trying to have a recognition that you can only work with the material that you have. We can only work with what exists under capitalism. But at the same time, that material isn't going to naturally turn into communism. There's no sort of like arrow of history. There's no teleology to it. All there is human beings struggling with the material that we have now with a conscious desire to liberate themselves, a sort of drive toward, or a desire for, communism. So to be a communist is not to have a program, but to have a particular attitude toward reality, which is striving to, negate the negation, or sort of subject, capitalism to the dialectic, I guess. Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny though, because like I'm very much with you, but part of it does kind of smack a little bit of the Bernstein, like the means are everything, the end means nothing. You know what I mean? Where it's like, well, first of all, I think her political conclusions are just broadly right. And especially, and honestly, like what she's saying about programs, it's like, how many limp Communist Party programs are there that are so detached from reality and an analysis of capitalism, if we're being honest, like that they just mean nothing. Again, it's this idea of transhistoricizing things. But then on the other hand, like, it's all well and good to say that you don't want to set out to define the mode of production, and you want to have this, this kind of faith that being a communist and acting as a communist is going to work and building a communist movement is going to have everything work itself out. I think that's okay. But then, like, you are already making assumptions about the mode of production that's coming just by virtue of calling it a classless society. Like, and that does require some thinking through about how that's going to work. And she's certainly made me think about the Critique of the Gotha program in a completely different light, in a way that I do find really enlightening. But there are pretty obvious moments in their remarks is like, if you want to have a classless society, you need to be considering how you're going to get rid of exploitation. And he does list, like, you have to make labor directly social, you have to do this, you have to do that. But he still does leave it open. Like, despite the fact that we get, the one like amazing thing that Marx wrote about communism, frustratingly, in a critique of another document, which is a way of organizing politically that he probably wasn't really fully on board with. She's right about that. And that is very frustrating. So you don't want to read too much into like the politics of this. But I think that you do kind of need a little bit of a like a value theory approach to the critique of the Gotha program where, okay, the movement is everything, sure, whatever, but like you're still claiming that you want to build a classless society, and there are things like there are certain ways that you have to do that. The thing about the kind of like economic program of the councilists as opposed to the like political program of Leninists or social democrats or something is that like they're making an effort to consider what those things are that you would need to adequately produce and distribute goods in a classless society. Um, and I do think that there's probably a distinction to be made between that kind of economic program, trans historical programmatization, which is really just like an analysis of capitalism and projecting that in kind of like a weird inverse fashion onto a classless society. I think there's a distinction to be made between that and the programs that she's talking about. Maybe there's room for kind of both. I certainly think that there is, but it's just I don't know, because like I said, on one hand, I really do appreciate this reading of the critique of the Gotha program, but there are some things in there where Marx is like, here's you would have to consider this, and the best part of that is she's right when he's you know engaging with a very specific political slogan, which is from each according to their ability, each according to their needs, which isn't really a slogan he was super keen on, but whatever. He was like, here's how you would get to that if that was your goal, which, it is the goal, I guess. But like, yeah, I don't know. I just think there's a distinction to be made there. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it would be quite negative to read everything seemingly positive that Marx says as purely being engaging somebody in a debate on their own terms, like just because this is like coming back to things we've read from Hal Draper in the past, just because Marx started using the idea of the particular phraseology of the dictatorship of the proletariat because he was debating a certain set of like Blanquyists who sort of like were talking in the terminology of dictatorship, and he wanted to use that word but like recast it, like I think that's like we could see it in those sort of negative terms as like he's purely he's just debating, he's just he's just trying to like I don't know, just trying to win arguments. He's just trying to get his point across. He's trying to make it. She there's a point. I don't know whether what I'm about to say represents her entire attitude, but there is a point in this when she's talking about the critique of the Gotha program where she casts it almost as like a desperate last ditch effort to like stop these idiots from releasing this stupid program. And like it's almost like Marx throwing up his hands in the air and just being like, okay, we're just gonna have to go along with this for a minute just because this is where these sort of basic socialist idiots are at, and what am I gonna do? So you could have that entirely negative reading, but like I want to imagine more that like Marx is this is an example of like the historical trans-historical thing. Like he's engaging in the debates of his time in language that's necessary in an effort to try and make correctives that are based on his academic understanding of what capitalism is and what it would mean to overcome capitalism. Like we, it's. I don't think it's. I hope, and I don't think her intention is to like cast off all programmatic thinking, all critical analytic work. Like she can't have this program. She can't make this case for if she is indeed making that case for what Marx's strategy is. It's quite hard to explain why Marx ever wrote Capital in the first place. To some extent, and all of his critiques are predicated on this understanding of political economy. So there has to be value to it, and like again, I sort of want to come back to this idea of like the strategy is to engage with the world as you find it, but engage with the world in a particular way, which is like intended to radically transform it. Like in some ways, I want to harken back to ways we've attempted to describe what's happening or what we'd like to imagine is happening in some elements of the Fundamental Principles book, where they're like taking an element of capitalist society, radically transforming it, but in appearance, it feels like it's performing the same function, but sort of like fundamentally, it has been subjected to this dialectical process such that like it operates in a different way. I feel like the strategy that's being argued for is that one where you're like a particular approach to engaging with the world, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think she's very. I was kind of worried this was going to be just because again, I like didn't really know anything about the book. I was very worried this was going to be, very party focused, very like, we need to rethink where we're at, specifically because it kind of began with this critique of post-Marxists and people who generally got lost in the weeds of there not really being a successful political movement and coming up with all sorts of wacky ideas to explain that, right? Like, but that's definitely not what this is. And I think that probably the best part about this book is her being like, well, you got to work with what you have, and when you hear about some of these just like super cringy communist groups who like try to have a hot take on like trans rights, and it's like, you don't need a hot take on trans rights, like it's good and it's part of a system of global emancipation, like give me a fucking break. She's very much just like, yeah, like this is all, you don't really want to create like a hierarchy of struggles. You really don't want to go into elements where proles are struggling for rights, for basic rights, or for, anti-racist struggles, anti-fascist struggles, and be like, well, that's all well and good, but have you considered councils? You know what I mean? Like, she's like, definitely don't do that. But at the same time, like, you do need to kind of like give direction to these struggles. And, this is actually something that really like we've come across in kind of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and also like the other Verso book with a very similar title, on organizing, by that guy Nunez. Forget exactly what it's
I'm
called.
looking for it on the shelf.
I was hoping you'd find it before
obscured by something else.
Yeah, people will know what I mean. Nunez Organization Verso, look that up. Where it's like, it's this idea of meeting people halfway, right? Where you really kind of have to see where global struggles are, help them on their own terms, but then also give them meaningful direction by tying their orientation together with other struggles, but then also giving it direction by making, trying to help them become anti-capitalist. And, I think that would sound obvious to anybody that's not a Marxist, but like, it's funny. It's funny because it's a really good way of just getting around the, supposed dichotomy of wanting to make sure that I'm organizing as a communist and as a communist should, but also being a normal human being and just helping people, and that being your first, like that should be why you're trying to organize. And so, yeah, I don't know. Again, sounds obvious, but the idea of meeting people halfway, I think, does actually have real strategic merit. And most communist groups probably aren't willing to do that. You know what I mean?
Maybe there's like a fundamental mistaking what Marx is doing in so much of his writing. All of his interventions that are actually, we've just described as like, there's an extent to which he's meeting people halfway, right? He's talking to other political groups in their own terminology, trying to make mediation, sort of like interventions, which sort of like are a bit of a corrective. But then lots of Marxists have read all these as like actually Marx is being a pedant, and
Yeah.
sort of mistaken that as being like meaningful political practice to just go and write like pedantic critiques based on like sort of theory that actually doesn't have any bearing on people's real experience, which is not what Marx was doing, but maybe people can't recognize that, I guess.
Yeah. What did you get much from the section of this book where she was trying to compare what Marx was trying to do in his kind of analysis of the English working class just like doing everything short of like outright pogroms to the Irish working class that were, undercutting their wages, the immigrant Irish working class, trying to kind of like unite those struggles. And and when she was trying to kind of like compare that to Marx's analysis of the Civil War. Do you get much from that?
I mean, no, I mean, what I took from that was more like um, she was seemingly trying to make the case that Marx became like more interested in world affairs, more interested in developing a sort of meaningful critique of imperialism and other forces that might be sort of dividing the working class in various ways. She also sort of morphs that into a discussion of like his letter to Vera Zuzulich and discussions of the possibility of like what could come from um, like a socialist alliance in Russia with Russian peasants and how the sort of Russian commune could morph into sort of like something more communistic without a sort of diversion into sort of a capitalist mode. But I guess other than a sort of general take on Marx's like sort of reevaluating what it means to be internationalist um, from a strategic standpoint, how it would be, yeah, sort of like developing an understanding of what it would mean to unite the working class in the context of the sort of like divisions within the global working class and how capitalism plays one aspect of the working class off against another. So I imagine that represents like a sort of like deepening of his understanding and sort of moving away from a purely theoretical conception of what the working class is and sort of recognizing that it's divided and different ways that it needs to be reunited, I guess. But
it's, you know what it is? It's Marx making an auxiliary statement. That's what
yes.
it is. I really like, I didn't know this. I like how she said that in that letter to Vera Zuzulich, the famous letter, Marx wrote like 3 different drafts that were like incredibly long and then just sent her that short one and was like, I don't know, maybe it could work. Sure.
Yeah, whatever.
Like, okay.
But he has to work out that he doesn't disagree. And then he just says, I don't disagree.
Yeah. But it's funny because like the quotes that she gives from his drafts are so much more like nuanced and well thought out, where she seems to be implying that Marx considered that like the peasant mer wasn't actually like a vehicle for communism as such as like maybe a vehicle for like social democracy, kind of skipping the like liberal turn of capitalism. Which is a really interesting idea. And I think what I took from this sections is very much just that like Marxism, as generally discussed, is super abstract and deals in abstractions necessarily because it's trying to talk about these big wheel of history moments, right? And it's talking about aggregates like classes, and its economics are talking about aggregates like value, which really only work themselves out over average. And these kind of like different political I don't know, these times when Marx takes a stand on certain political issues of his own time, whether being, like standing up for the Irish working class and being like, kind of half scolding the British working class as being like, really? Like it was England that's made all these people come over here with their like colonization of Ireland. And also like trying to get them to understand that the reason their wages are being undercut are because of like, the economics of capitalism and all this stuff. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that like, even though we consider Marxism as being very abstract because it necessarily needs to be in a lot of its analyses, like Marx does have very concrete political goals when he engages in these moments of kind of like global politics or regional politics. And, the reason for that, I guess, is to just say that, like, again, you don't want to just place an abstract map over everything and just be like, why aren't the Irish befriending their English neighbors in the ghettos? Why aren't like why aren't the Americans, like the white Americans, all fighting for the abolition of slavery? It is like you need to be very nuanced when you talk about like politics, which again, another thing that would probably sound incredibly obvious to somebody that's not a Marxist, but like you want to have these goals in mind, the goal of communism. You want to have all of these different things in mind, and the ways in which all these political struggles relate to each other without kind of just abstracting over the real concrete differences that exist in various political struggles. And also, just as a side note, it's always so startling for me when I read a like contemporary like communist discussing American slavery, by which I mean contemporary to, you know, the period of American slavery, because it's like the most progressive stuff you're taught about like Americans at that time was that they were just like abolitionists. Why can't everybody get along? Come on, everybody. Why aren't we doing this? And to like actually have a like well thought out, considered radical political economy of the situation, it always just throws me off guard. I'm like, right, this was the same
other
time.
People were thinking, yeah.
Other people
I see what
were
you mean.
thinking like this.
Yeah. But also, sometimes it's hard to just recognize that one. I find it difficult to recognize that one piece of history maps onto another. This is the same period of time, but it's just a different part of the world. Yeah. I mean, that's just another example of like Marx not being teleological, you know. And you're like, there's a sort of negative reading of the idea of the auxiliary statement, where it's like, we've made a prediction, it's not worked. Let's like find a corrective, right? But like, I think that the proper thing to recognize is like, to recognize Marx's theoretical strategy as being one of like creating, coming back to the sort of scientific understanding of that, like creating abstract laws and then working out how those laws interact with the actual material of the world. But this is coming back to Marx, as I say, like not being teleological. He's not saying that capitalism naturally creates a working class, which naturally recognizes its sort of like collective dispossession and allies itself through solidarity. But like, it's Marx recognizing that history happens and there are countervailing tendencies, and you have to work with the material of the world that you have and try and work out how to prompt it in the right direction, or like make communist interventions. But it's not just going to happen in and of itself. You know, communism's not just going to happen.
And that attitude seems seemingly what she's saying is communism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that is the act of building communism.
To be a communist is to recognize that you like need to do it.
Damn it. God damn it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can't just wait for the Vulcans to show up and show us the error of our ways.
That's a shame. Yeah. Marx thoroughly follows the prime directive, unfortunately. One thing, we didn't really talk too much about Laclau, and I think maybe it's just worth touching on him because I think that he is basically like, well, it's better because he is kind of engaging with some Marxism and socialism in general. Like, he's kind of just like most liberals, you know what I mean? Yeah. And what I mean by that is like, she really criticizes him, even though he's like this guy who, I guess for a long time, I was never like in these circles, but I guess for a long time was like being read by postgrads, you know what I mean? And was like very influential in those circles about like rethinking.
Big in my day.
Yeah, there you go. Again, another life. What are you going to do? I would imagine people are still reading him.
Yeah. There are still liberals. You know?
There are still liberals. Yeah, exactly. The thing that she criticizes him for is kind of just eschewing political economy in general and conceiving of capitalism, which is interesting because this, on my first reading, kind of seemingly clashed with some things that she was saying later in the book. But he doesn't consider capitalism as a mode of production. And because of that, he just assumes that it's like a structure of power, which is something that like loads of different, he's not the first and he certainly won't be the last person to think like that. But the issue with that is because, again, it eschews a kind of Marxist theory of conflict, which is one that is more dialectical. And it's like there are these opposing sides, which can only really ever be solved by a kind of like a radical transformation of society into a classless society, right? But it's also like when you conceive of capitalism as just a series of power structures, it makes the world completely free from any kind of like determinism, and it kind of radically, in a very similar way to a lot of like actually communist thinking in her way of thinking about this, it kind of detaches itself from contemporary capitalism and real movements of capitalism now, and just makes it this thing that you can just slap on any moment of capitalism and just, you know, just overcome the power structures, do a little bit of politicking, get the right guy in there, and it'll all be fine. You know?
It's funny, isn't it, that in contrast to Badiou, you know, Badiou's like it's all about the rupture and not about the sort of the political process. And Yeah, you look how it's just like we just reform, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
That must have been a really grim fucking time to try and be
Early
studying
90s,
Marxism.
try and be
The early
like,
90s.
try and be,
Yeah. It makes you, I don't know. It makes you be glad for the people that kind of stuck to their guns. Like, even if you do, I don't know, kind of disagree with them about different things, like, Meekson's Wood and Brenner and Kleiman and all of those people, like, hey, at least they were still like, no, there are still fundamental contradictions.
Yeah.
Like,
try and be a Marxist in the 90s.
yeah.
The crisis is coming.
Yeah. What are you gonna do? It's so funny though, like reading all the post-Marxist stuff, you just get the feeling that it's just like, it's kind of, she is making this point too. It's just like, that is just the degeneracy of kind of like theory in a moment when the real movement is so stagnant. Like, she's not trying to say that like Laclau or Badiou or Hart or Negri or any of these people are like bad people, with bad ideas. She's just kind of saying like, to a certain extent, like, they're looking at the world. They don't see this movement anymore. Soviet Union has fallen apart. It seems like the proletariat isn't a force, but there are still forces and there are still crises. So maybe it's not the proletariat. Maybe it's the multitude. Maybe it's not this. Maybe it's the common. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you can understand it, but it is just, I don't want to be like a base superstructure guy, but it's like, yeah, I mean, you can see in a moment of like political and economic crisis that mirrors itself pretty clearly in academia.
The one thing I might say at the end, that like toward the end of the book, there was like a little discussion of Gramsci, who's someone I've never really interacted with, and I don't really know what to have to say about this necessarily, but like I came away, I felt like what she was arguing for, and something which I felt quite motivated by, was almost, she seemed to be implying that like there's a requirement to sort of recreate narrative, I suppose, recreate sort of like a way of talking about communism which is less analytic and a bit more kind of like, I don't know, like, yeah, just forceful in its rhetoric and its narrative and it's an imaginary. Just the idea of trying to find a positive way to talk to talk to normal people about like what a radical sort of like transition might look like, and like how to create that, how to have that be something creative and something that's easy to engage with, or like positive to engage with. Just sort of, I find it quite provoking as a kind of like, as a proposition, I guess.
Yeah, and also just generally too, like the idea of what was the word she used? Self-emancipation, self, like a realization or something like that. Like, she did try to tie the, communism as process into this idea of like, I don't want to sound like a self-help guy, but like becoming a better person and like realizing yourself. And she does seem to say that like, Gramsci's idea of like the organic intellectual is quite important in that regard, not merely because it's like a moral thing about you don't want intellectuals sitting in universities telling people what to think and thinking they're better than each other. But it's like organic intellectuals, people have actually come up through, working class struggles, I suppose, but their theory is informed by their experience. Like, that has its own merits for communism as a struggle, which is, quite good.
And there's definitely in this a sense that like that sort of liberation of the individual can only come about with liberation of a community. That's like a collective process. Harking it back to another quote to Marx, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's always nice to read some things that kind of skirt that line about like, self-emancipation as opposed actually at all, like in coordination with emancipation of society. It's like, what you're saying about narratives, it's like, that's exactly true. It's like, you can really only become the best possible person, surprise, surprise, in a society that doesn't have class. Like, and what that movement actually means to that is, it's good. Oh, we got to an hour, Dan.
Great.
I'm glad. Some dense stuff, some very dense stuff. I don't know if I would necessarily suggest reading this whole book to people unless you are a like Badiou sicko or a Hart Negri sicko, or just a post-Marx, want to understand post-Marxism in general. But the sections where she puts forward this reading of Marx, I think, are really, really interesting. Yeah, I'll say that.
Top notch.
Top notch. Yeah, exactly. All right, Dan. Well, when we come back, baseball playoffs will have started, so I'll be a mess. I'll be a mess of nerves, but you know what? Till then, it should all be good.
Yeah, rest up then.
Rest up. I'm picking several other teams to root for other than the Dodgers because
okay.
It's all going to get fucked up. All right.
Good luck with that. All right, then. Thanks again, John. Well, thanks for doing this.
Talk to you later. Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.